Self-development with tactics. So, today we're going to talk about Kierkegaard's philosophy. As a summary by the philosophy.com site. As always, the link is going to be down in the description. I do think that maybe this is going to be some sort of a series, since I'm very, very, very interested in philosophy, and I don't know, I think that I also tend to be philosophical about my own life and about things that I'm experiencing and I'm encountering essentially as well, which I don't know. I think that words are powerful, and also being able to verbalize things is incredibly powerful. And today a very good friend of mine, whom I'm very grateful for having, so shout out to you, maybe you're gonna see that someday, was helping me with a problem that I'm having, and he was very philosophical about it, and also explaining me his quote-unquote life philosophy and all parts of it, which was very interesting. And I do understand, and it's just because of that, well, not just because of that, but including that, it's been definitely quite a useful idea and an important idea to ask him, because I've understood that this might definitely be one of the reasons why that we as a group, we are friends, since we kind of share not necessarily the same thoughts and the same ideas and perspectives, but more or less the way of maybe living life and dealing with life, and just being to make it clear and precise, being philosophical about life. But anyway, we're going to talk about Søren Kierkegaard. I would actually really like to know how to pronounce his name correctly, but we're going to go through it. The first part is the existentialist philosophy of Søren Kierkegaard. Among the essential works of Kierkegaard, the Danish existentialist philosopher wrote The Alternative from 1843, Fear and Traveling from 1843 as well, The Concept of Anxiety 1844, Concluding Unscientific Proscript to Philosophical Fragments 1846, The Sickness Unto Death 1849, and the last one is Either/or, where there apparently is no date. Kierkegaard contrasts the philosophical system because he asserts the truth of individual existence and subjectivity. Become subjective is the highest task that he assigns to man. Subjectivity is truth is one of the most famous quotes by Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard versus, I think, Hegel, I assume that it is German, existence versus system. Kierkegaard is not a philosopher and did not want a philosopher. He did not write system and refused, opposed by Hegel, to build up a philosophical system where truths are coordinated and united into a totality. What is the system? It means a closed world, integrating all the truths and unifying them. The system is wrong to repudiate any separation and distinction. It coordinates the real in a fully closed. It contains is an achievement and offense. Hegelian cons will bring together the knowledge and the various spiritual manifestations within a closed. Kierkegaard reminds us that the existence, the mode of being of the individual subject, is precisely the opposite of the system. Life is anything but a closed world. It is opening, rupture, and discontinuity. To exist is to be there, unfinished, separate out any system, and of course any abstraction. Indeed, Kierkegaard also rejects the abstraction. What? Quabstre? I think? Well, I don't know. Seems to be French, but I don't speak French. It's isolating in concept, some determinations excluding others. The abstraction means by which this operation removes the concrete thought, temporality, the individual experience, to delve into the conceptual idealism. Hegel, thus, he emphasized the value of this process where we exclude the concrete determinations. On the contrary, says Kierkegaard, in a cry passionately anti-Hegelian, a lack of abstraction is manifest. That's life, it drains the concrete existence as such. The abstract thinker is an imaginary being living in the pure abstraction. He believes inhabit a palace of ideas, but he lives in a cottage, the concepts that know life or depth. Abstract. Well, I kind of have a feeling that the sentences just don't make any sense, you know? It might actually be translated from French. Well, since I got some sort of I don't know what it's called, but a notification, you know, in terms of, or because of cookies, and it was in French. So I just pressed something. So anyway, abstraction, system. These are not the only perils or pitfalls that await the existing, and it is a third, and its history. Indeed, the latter means, in Hegel, becoming spiritually oriented, leading to full transparency, to a balance of all the tensions, and even to a decision of the dialectic. Kierkegaard, meanwhile, sees a great universal history noisemaker, a process that profoundly misleading because that is... I just can't go through that. German philosophers. Kierkegaard, well, he's in German. Kierkegaard's philosophy, maybe let's... You know, it's 6 minutes. Maybe there was some some things that made sense, but Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Should I have a look at this one? Let's actually have a look. I don't know. Maybe there's something in here. I don't wanna spare. Kierkegaard's life, Kierkegaard's rhetoric, aesthetics, ethics, religion, politics, life and works, academic tools, other internal sources. Let's actually go through rhetorics. Kierkegaard's central problematic was how to become a Christian in Christendom. The task was most difficult for the well-educated, since prevailing education and cultural institutions tended to produce stereotyped members of the crowd, quote-unquote, rather than to allow individuals to discover their own unique identities. This problem was compounded by the fact that Denmark had recently and very rapidly been transformed from a feudal or feudal society into a capitalist society. Universal elementary education, large-scale migration from rural areas into cities, and greatly increased social mobility meant that the social structure changed from a rigidly hierarchical one to a relatively horizontal one. In this context, it became increasingly difficult to become who you are for two reasons. Now I get the whole individualism thing. Social identities were usually fluid, which is the first one, and the second one is there was a proliferation of normalizing institutions, which produced pseudo-individuals. Given this problematic in this social context, Kierkegaard perceived a need to invent a form of communication which would not produce stereotyped identities. On the contrary, he needed a form of rhetoric which would force people back onto their own resources, to take responsibility for their own existential choices, and to become who they are beyond their socially imposed identities. In this undertaking, Kierkegaard was inspired by the figure of Socrates, whose incessant irony undermined all knowledge claims that were taken for granted or unreflectively inherited from traditional culture. In his dissertation on the concept of irony, with constant reference to Socrates, Kierkegaard argued that the historical Socrates used his irony in order to facilitate the birth of subjectivity in his interlocutors, because they were constantly forced to abandon their immediate answers to Socrates' annoying questions. They had to begin to think for themselves and to take individual responsibility for their claims about knowledge and value. Which is actually a great tactic if you think about it in that way. Kierkegaard sought to provide a similar service for his own contemporaries. He used irony, parody, satire, humor, and deconstructive techniques in order to make conventionally accepted forms of knowledge and value untenable. He was a gadfly, constantly irritating constantly irritating his contemporaries with discomforting thoughts. He was also a midwife, assisting at the birth of individual subjectivity by forcing his contemporaries to develop an inner life through critical self-reflection. His art of communication became the art of taking away, since he thought his audience suffered from too much knowledge rather than too little. Hegelianism from Hegel promised to make absolute knowledge available by virtue of the science of logic. Anyone with the capacity to follow the dialectical progression of the perpetually transparent concepts of Hegel's logic would have access to the mind of God, which for Hegel was equivalent to the logical structure of the universe. Kierkegaard thought this to be the hubristic attempt to build a new Tower of Babel, or a Scala Paradisi, a dialectical ladder by which humans can climb with ease up to heaven. Kierkegaard's strategy was to invert this dialectic by seeking to make everything more difficult. Instead of seeing scientific knowledge as the means of human redemption, he regarded it as the greatest obstacle to redemption. Instead of seeking to give people more knowledge, he sought to take away what passed for knowledge. Instead of seeking to make God and Christian faith perfectly intelligible, he sought to emphasize the absolute transcendence by God of all human categories. Instead of setting himself up as a religious authority, Kierkegaard used a vast array of textual devices to undermine his authority as an author and to place responsibility for the existential significance to be derived from his text squarely on the reader, which is amazing if you think about it and if you're able to do so. Which, I mean, if you're able to, speak your words in such a way that, if I can paraphrase that as far as I can understand it, so that the reader needs to look at him or herself to maybe find the information, even though, he says that information is not the problem, but too much information. Let's actually read ahead. Kierkegaard distanced himself from his texts by a variety of devices which served to problematize the authorial voice for the reader. He used pseudonyms in many of his works, both overtly aesthetic ones and overtly religious ones. He partitioned the texts into prefaces, forewords, interludes, postscripts, appendices. He assigned the authorship of parts of texts to different pseudonyms and invented further pseudonyms to be the editors or compilers of these pseudonymous writings. Sometimes Kierkegaard appended his name as an author, sometimes as the person responsible for publication, sometimes not at all. Sometimes Kierkegaard would publish more than one book on the same day. This simultaneous book embodied strikingly contrasting perspectives. He also published a whole series of works simultaneously, the pseudonymous works on the one hand, and on the other hand, the edifying discourses published under his own name. All of this play with narrative point of view, with contrasting works and with contrasting internal partitions within individual works, leaves the reader very disoriented. In combination with the incessant play of irony and Kierkegaard's predilection for paradox and semantic opacity, the texts became a polished surface to the reader in which the prime meaning to be discerned is the reader's own reflection. Christian faith for Kierkegaard is not a matter of learning dogma by rote. It is a matter of the individual repeatedly renewing her passionate, subjective relationship to an object which can never be known but only believed in. This belief is offensive to reason since it only exists in the face of the absurd, the paradox of the eternal, immortal, infinite God being incarnated in time as a finite mortal. Kierkegaard's method of indirect communication was designed to serve the reliance of the reader on the authority of the author and on the received wisdom of the community. The reader was to be forced to take individual responsibility for knowing who he or she is and for knowing where she or he stands on the existential, ethical, and religious issues raised in the texts. While much of Kierkegaard's writing is presented indirectly under various pseudonyms, he did publish some works under his own name. These works fall into three genres. The first one is deliberations, the second edifying discourses, and the third, reviews. The point of indirect communication is to position the reader to relate to the truth with appropriate passion, rather than to communicate the truth as such, which, as I'm thinking about it, is tremendous. If you're able to, if I'm understanding correctly, which may or may not be the case, but if you communicate something in a way that makes the reader feel like that he or she is discovering the truth on his or her own, it is amazing, since people like to be in charge of things and like to think that they have achieved something. But of course, if the author is presenting it to them, it's not the same experience. It's not the same thing. It's like, okay, you gave it to me. Which is something completely different than, okay, I found it myself. Which, if you think about the fact that he published contrasting things, is amazing. I mean, okay, if I read this, but if I read the other thing as well, quite simultaneously, just to make things more easy, then the reader comes to the point like, wow, okay, these are contrasting. So what is the truth? It apparently is not what's in these books, or what should I think? Is it the first one, or is it the second book, or is it the second book or the first one? Is it the pearl, or is it the contra book? And then it is indeed the case that the reader has to think on his or her own what makes sense, rather than if you read one thing and just believe in it. It's amazing. It's amazing work. But it is also very self-destructive if you think about it. You are having an opinion, and he probably also is having an opinion. But in the end, he crushes his own opinion for the sake of the reader being able to see what is right for them. Which I mean, we all wanna influence people. But this is, at least at my point of view, very selfless. It's insane. There's definitely going to be more content on such things. It's amazing to think about these things. I tremendously appreciate that, and I know that there's also people that appreciate that as well. Christopher's Philosophy Hour, I don't know, would be an amazing thing, and I am also pretty much looking forward to going through the book that my brother, not my friend, gave me. Let's see. The point of indirect communication is to position the reader to relate to the truth with appropriate passion, rather than to communicate the truth as such. In the review, however, it is appropriate to be objective, especially in drawing out a novel's life view and life development. A deliberation or overveils what the fuck, on the other hand, ought to be provocative and turn the reader's assumptions topsy-turvy. It draws on irony, the comic, and is high-spirited in order to get thoughts into motion prior to action. A deliberation is a weighing up as a propedoic to action, and identifying discourse, or edifying discourse, by contrast, rests in a mood and presupposes that the reader is already in faith. It seeks to build up the faith that is presupposed. Typically, Kierkegaard's edifying discourses invites that single individual, my reader, to dwell with a biblical passage for the sake of building up faith. Kierkegaard published many of his edifying discourses in shorter collection to accompany particular pseudonym texts, then later published them again in larger collections. He also published various discourses as the Communion on Fridays, which closely resembles sermons, although they are delivered without authority. These are particularly intimate addresses to the sincere Christian who strives to deepen the subjective position of faith through confession and through acceptance of divine forgiveness. It's amazing. It really, Kierkegaard draws attention to Christianity's inverted dialect, which demands that we exercise quote-unquote double vision to see in worldly things their spiritual opposites, such as hope in hopelessness, strength in weakness, and prosperity and adversity. The inverse dialectic also requires that we reduplicate our thoughts in our actions, but in so doing that we work against ourselves. This was aimed at subverting our focus on worldly goals in order to refocus on other worldly goals. Kierkegaard's rhetorical play with the inverse Christian dialect was designed not to make the word of God easier to assimilate, but to establish more clearly the absolute distance that separates human beings from God. This was in order to emphasize that human beings are absolutely reliant on God's grace for salvation. While most commentators regard Kierkegaard's view to be that sin is what separates human beings absolutely from God, thereby lending weight to the view that Kierkegaard endorses a particularly dour version of Christianity. A more defensible interpretation is that it is the transcendent God's capacity to forgive the unforgivable that marks the absolute difference. Our struggle to accept divine forgiveness can become mirrored in despair, including the second-order despair over the impossibility of forgiveness of our sins and the demonic despair of defiance in which we refuse to accept forgiveness. On the other hand, faith in divine forgiveness can manifest in joy at the realization that for God anything is possible, including our rebirth as spiritual selves with eternal validity. And that's it with Kierkegaard's rhetoric. The next point would be Kierkegaard's aesthetics, which we may or may not go through. Maybe I'm going to have a look at it at first. Well, Kierkegaard's ethics would probably be interesting if I can take the word ethics as literally, like, well, you know what I mean. But with that being said, I'm gonna end the episode. I really do hope that you've gotten something out of it. I definitely kinda have. I do think it's amazing. I didn't understand everything, which would be overdone to say and to say, but yeah. Anyway, gonna end the episode there. So I wish you the best. See you.